October light slanted through the glass towers of Hayes Aerospace Technologies, cutting sharp angles across the executive parking lot where 50 engineers and department heads had gathered in a loose circle. The quarterly innovation showcase always drew a crowd. Victoria Hayes stood at the center champagne flute catching afternoon sun, her other hand wrapped around a wireless microphone. At 43, she commanded every room she entered, blonde hair, pulled back in a style that suggested control. Without effort, her Alexander McQueen suit tailored to specifications that left no room for doubt about who made decisions here. The tradition had started 5 years ago, shortly after her father's death left her the company. Show off your new toys. Celebrate success. Remind everyone that Hayes Aerospace didn't just build components for other people's aircraft, it shaped the future of flight itself. Tesla Model S sedans occupied the premium spots near the entrance. A BMW i8 gleamed electric blue under the California sky. Marcus Webb from Advanced Propulsion had arrived in a Mercedes EQS that whispered when it moved all torque and silence, and $200,000 of German engineering. Then there was the Mustang. Victoria's gaze drifted to the back corner of the lot, where rust consumed a vehicle that should have been scrapped a decade ago. The hood wore corrosion like a disease spreading in patterns that suggested neither care nor attention. Passenger door hung slightly crooked, the kind of misalignment that spoke of an accident never properly repaired. Paint had faded to a color between dried blood and old brick, the kind of finish that made you wonder if the car had always been this shade, or if time had simply beaten the original hue into submission. She raised the microphone, letting silence build until every phone was raised, every face turned her direction. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the future of transportation. Laughter rolled through the crowd like thunder before a storm. Someone shouted about finding it in a junkyard. Another voice called out, asking if it ran on optimism and duct tape. Victoria let the moment stretch, feeding on the energy, the validation, the simple pleasure of being the person everyone watched. The quarterly showcase had become more than tradition. It had become theater, and she'd learned from her father that business was always theater when you knew how to play it right. Brad Thornton appeared at her elbow, 42 years old, and Harvard-educated vice president of operations, and the kind of man who kept two cars because one couldn't possibly contain all his success. His smile carried that particular edge of someone who measured his own worth by the discomfort he caused in others. Victoria, we should probably get started with the actual presentations. She waved him off as without looking, the attention fixed on that rusted disaster occupying valuable real estate in her parking lot. Not yet. I want everyone to see this first. 30 feet away, Jake Sullivan stood with a mop handle gripped in hands that bore calluses from work that left permanent marks. Gray coveralls hung loose on his frame. At 52, he looked closer to 60 shoulders bent from years of labor that measured value in square feet, clean per hour, rather than innovations launched or markets captured. He'd been pushing that mop bucket across the lobby floor when noise from outside had pulled him toward the glass doors, drawn by something he couldn't quite name, but recognized anyway, the particular quality of laughter that came at someone's expense rather than from genuine joy. 4 years he'd worked here. 4 years of existing in that peculiar space where people looked through you rather than at you, where your presence mattered only in its absence, noticed only when trash cans overflowed, or floors bore scuff marks, or bathrooms ran out of paper towels. The Hayes Aerospace campus sprawled across 40 acres in Mountain View glass and steel, an ambition made manifest, and Jake Sullivan cleaned it all. Every surface, every corner, every trace that humans had occupied these spaces and left their mess behind. He recognized some faces in that crowd. Patricia Reeves from engineering, brilliant and focused, the kind of mind that could see 3 moves ahead in any technical problem. David Kim from propulsion systems, young enough to still believe that innovation alone could change the world. Marcus Webb, whose new Mercedes probably cost more than Jake had earned in the last 3 years combined. None of them had ever spoken to him. Why would they? He was furniture. He was infrastructure. He was the invisible machinery that kept their visible world functioning. Brad materialized beside him with the particular smile that meant trouble incoming. Jake, Victoria wants to see something. The request landed like an order because that's exactly what it was. Jake leaned his mop against the wall, feeling the weight of every eye that would soon turn his direction. He'd known this moment was coming. Part of him had been waiting for it since the day he'd submitted his application under a false name, fabricated a history that suggested no education beyond high school, no career beyond manual labor, no past beyond the person who showed up to clean. He followed Brad through the glass doors into sunshine that felt too bright, too exposed, too much like stepping onto a stage where the performance had already been written, and all that remained was playing his assigned role. The crowd parted as he approached. Victoria's voice carried across the parking lot, amplified by speakers someone had positioned for maximum effect. There he is, our guest of honor. Jake stopped walking. Every face turned toward him, phones raised to capture whatever was about to happen, that particular hunger for entertainment that came from watching someone else's discomfort. Brad gestured him forward with the impatience of someone who had meetings scheduled and deals to close and a life that mattered beyond this parking lot theater. Come on, don't be shy. We're doing our quarterly innovation showcase. Everyone shows off their new rides, talks about the future of transportation. I thought we should be inclusive. Even our support staff deserves recognition. Laughter rippled outward from Victoria like stones dropped in still water. Jake felt his jaw tighten, muscles bunching under skin, weathered by years of exposure to chemicals and cleaners, in the particular kind of erosion that came from doing work nobody noticed. He thought about walking away. He thought about maintaining the careful invisibility he'd cultivated for 4 years. He thought about Sarah, the hospital room, her hand in his so small and fragile toward the end, all the strength that had built engines and solved problems and believed in futures that seemed impossible, but reduced to barely enough energy to whisper those final words. Don't let them bury it, Jake. Don't let them win. Victoria raised the microphone again, playing to her audience with the skill of someone who'd learned performance from a master. That is your car, isn't it? The vintage model in the back. More laughter, louder this time. Someone whistled. Someone else made a comment about classic restoration that drew fresh waves of amusement. Jake stood very still, aware of the weight pressing against his chest. The engine hidden beneath that rusted hood. The technology that could change everything if he let it. The promise he'd made to a dying woman that he would finish what they'd started together. Something shifted inside him then. 4 years of invisibility cracking like old paint under pressure. You want to see if it runs, the laughter stuttered and stopped. Victoria raised an eyebrow, champagne glass, paused halfway to lips, painted a shade of red that probably had a name like authority or confidence or power. Brad's hand landed on Jake's shoulder with pressure that suggested retreat, that implied this was the moment to back down and remember his place in the hierarchy. Jake, maybe you should just... But Jake was already walking toward the Mustang. The crowd parted again, confusion replacing amusement. Whispers starting up behind him like wind through leaves. What's he doing? Is he serious? This should be interesting. Each step carried weight, carried history, carried the memory of every blueprint Sarah had drawn, every calculation they'd refined together, every night spent in their garage, chasing an idea that seemed impossible until it wasn't. He reached the car and put his hand on the door handle. Metal warm from afternoon sun, familiar under his palm, comforting in the way that only things you've touched 10,000 times could be. The door opened with the squeal of hinges that needed oil. Had needed oil for years, would probably always need oil, because some things you left exactly as they were, preserved in their imperfection, as reminder of where you'd been and how far you'd come. Jake slid into the driver's seat. The smell hit him immediately, old leather and motor oil, and something else, something only he could identify anymore. Sarah's perfume. Faint now, almost gone, fading the way memories faded, when you had nothing left but the ghost of presence, the shadow of what had been. He'd sprayed it on the seats every few months for the first 5 years after she died, then every year, then only on their anniversary. Now it was almost gone, and he didn't know if losing it completely would be relief or final surrender. His hands found the steering wheel, fingers settling into grooves worn by thousands of miles, by cross-country trips they'd taken when the engine was new and the world had seemed full of possibility, by lonely drives he'd taken after she was gone, and the world had seemed emptied of everything that mattered. I'm sorry, I tried to stay invisible, but they won't let me. He spoke to her, to the absence, to the memory that lived in this car more vividly than anywhere else. Then he turned the key. The engine didn't sputter or cough or wheeze or groan. It didn't make any of the sounds you'd expect from a 50-year-old car, with rust eating its hood, with a passenger door that hadn't closed right since 2009, with paint faded to the color of regret. Instead, it sang, deep, smooth, powerful a harmonic that rolled across the parking lot like thunder, like music, like nothing anyone in that crowd had ever heard come from a vehicle. The sound was wrong in every way that mattered to conventional understanding of how engines worked. Too clean, too perfect, too alive. It hummed with frequencies that shouldn't exist in combustion, with resonances that suggested something other than gasoline, burning in chambers with a quality that made people's teeth vibrate and their chest cavities thrum in sympathetic response. Jake revved the engine once. The sound built climbing in pitch and power, but maintaining that impossible smoothness, that perfect harmonic balance that defied every principle of mechanical engineering anyone at Hayes Aerospace had ever studied. He revved it again. Someone in the crowd made a sound that might have been disbelief or wonder or fear. He revved it a third time, letting the Aurora engine, Sarah's engine, their engine, the engine that had cost them everything, announce itself to the world that had tried to bury it. Then he killed the ignition. Silence fell across the parking lot like a curtain dropping. Jake stepped out of the car without looking at anyone, without acknowledging the stunned faces or dropped jaws or phones still raised to capture what had just happened. He walked back toward the building with the measured pace of someone who had just crossed a line he could never uncross, who had just revealed a secret he could never hide again, who had just started something that would end in ways he couldn't predict or control. Victoria's voice chased him, all the mockery stripped away, replaced by something raw and desperate. Wait, what was that? What kind of engine is that? Jake kept walking, through the glass doors, past the lobby he'd mopped this morning, down the hallway where his cleaning cart still sat beside the supply closet. He returned to his work without looking back, disappearing into invisibility one final time before everything changed. Behind him, the crowd stood frozen, staring at the rusted Mustang, like they'd just witnessed something impossible made real. Because they had. They just didn't know it yet. They didn't know about the 7 years of development. They didn't know about the stolen patents. They didn't know about Sarah's final words, or Jake's patient waiting, or the revolution that had been hidden in their parking lot for 4 years, disguised as failure when it was actually the future. Victoria stood at the center of the silent crowd, champagne forgotten microphone dangling from her hand. Her mind raced through every engine sound she'd ever heard, Ferrari, Lamborghini, McLaren military jets, that could break the sound barrier, experimental propulsion systems her engineers had tested in sealed laboratories with acoustic dampening. Nothing matched what had just rolled across this parking lot. Nothing even came close. Brad appeared beside her, his voice low and careful. Victoria, I know what it was. She cut him off sharply, awareness already forming that whatever had just happened wasn't entertainment, wasn't a joke, wasn't something to be laughed at and forgotten. That sound had been real. That sound had been impossible. And Jake Sullivan, the janitor she'd humiliated in front of 50 people, had just driven away with something that could change everything. The showcase continued, but Victoria barely paid attention. Marcus Webb showed off his Mercedes, explaining its electric drivetrain and regenerative braking with the enthusiasm of someone who'd spent $200,000 and needed to justify it. Patricia Reeves demonstrated her Tesla's autopilot features. David Kim talked about the hydrogen fuel cell prototype his team was developing. All of it felt hollow, now irrelevant, like watching people celebrate the invention of the wheel while someone else had just figured out how to fly. Victoria made her excuses before the presentations finished, retreating to her office on the 42nd floor, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered views across Silicon Valley and beyond. She poured herself 2 fingers of bourbon she didn't drink, standing at the window, replaying that sound in her mind, trying to understand what she'd heard. Her phone buzzed. Text from Brad, need to talk, important. She ignored it. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, advice he'd given her before he died, when cancer had reduced him from titan of industry to frail figure in a hospital bed, when death had made him reflective in ways he'd never been while building his empire. Victoria, the most dangerous moment in business is when you think you understand everything. That's when someone comes along with something you've never seen before and destroys you. William Hayes had died 7 years ago, leaving her a company worth $4 billion, leaving her his legacy, leaving her the weight of following a man who'd built empires from nothing. She'd spent every day since trying to prove she belonged in his shadow, that she could carry forward what he'd started, that being born into wealth didn't make her weak or unworthy or less than he'd been. Now she stood in her office, and wondered what else he'd left her that she didn't know about. The bourbon stayed untouched. Victoria returned to her desk and opened her computer, fingers moving across keys with the precision of someone who'd learned that information was power and knowledge was currency, and understanding your enemies meant first understanding yourself. She pulled up personnel files, searching for Jake Sullivan, finding his employment records sparse and unremarkable. Hired 4 years ago. Background check showed high school education, no college, spotty work history before Hayes Aerospace. References from previous janitorial positions that nobody had bothered to verify because who investigated janitors? She dug deeper. Social media presence non-existent. Credit history minimal. Address a small apartment in East Palo Alto, the kind of place where people lived when they wanted to be close to Silicon Valley wealth without being part of it. Nothing suggested anything beyond exactly what he appeared to be, a middle-aged man doing manual labor, living paycheck to paycheck, invisible in the machinery of American economic hierarchy. But that engine, that impossible, beautiful, wrong engine. Victoria closed the personnel file and sat back in her chair, mind racing through possibilities. Custom work by an enthusiast. Unlikely the sound was too refined, too advanced. Stolen military technology. Possible, but how would a janitor access classified systems? Something he'd built himself that raised questions about who Jake Sullivan really was beneath the gray coveralls and calloused hands. Her phone rang. Brad again. This time she answered. What? His voice came through, sharp with urgency. I've been asking around. Nobody knows anything about that car. Jake parks it in the same spot every day, drives it home every night, never talks about it. But Victoria, I did some digging on Sullivan himself, and he's not who he says he is. The background check we ran when he was hired, it was surface level. High school dropout, basic work history. But I started pulling threads. That high school doesn't have any record of him. Those previous employers, half of them don't exist anymore, and the ones that do have no employment records going back far enough. It's like he appeared 4 years ago out of nowhere. Victoria's pulse quickened. She stood and returned to the window, watching employees cross the campus below, tiny figures moving between buildings, all of them working toward futures they believed in, none of them knowing that their CEO was discovering something that could unravel everything. Find out who he really is. I don't care what it costs. I don't care who you have to hire. I want to know everything, where he came from, what he did before this, why he's here, what that engine is, and where it came from. Brad's hesitation carried across the line. Victoria, it's almost midnight. Maybe we should wait until I don't pay you to tell me when it's an appropriate time to work. I pay you to do what I need done when I need it done. Find out who Jake Sullivan is. Find out tonight. She hung up before he could respond, standing in darkness, broken only by the glow of computer screens and distant lights from buildings that never fully slept. Silicon Valley ran on ambition and fear, in equal measure ambition to build the future, fear of being left behind when someone else built it first. Victoria had always believed she understood both. Now she wondered if she'd been operating from a position of ignorance, blind to threats hiding in plain sight, right under her nose, cleaning her floors and emptying her trash while carrying secrets worth more than her entire company. Sleep didn't come that night. Victoria lay in her penthouse bedroom, 37 floors above San Francisco, staring at ceiling shadows cast by city lights that never quite went dark, listening to that engine replay in her mind like a song she couldn't forget. Every detail felt important. The smoothness of the sound, the harmonic complexity, the way it had sustained that perfect note without variation or degradation. The absolute certainty that what she'd heard was impossible and yet had happened anyway. She'd grown up around engines. Her father had started Hayes Aerospace as an auto parts manufacturer before pivoting to aerospace components. She'd spent childhood weekends in garages and factories, surrounded by the smell of gasoline and the roar of combustion, learning to distinguish a Ferrari V12 from a Lamborghini V10 by sound alone, understanding that power and performance could be measured in frequencies and harmonics as much as horsepower and torque. That engine in Jake's Mustang wasn't anything she'd ever encountered. It suggested principles of operation that shouldn't exist: energy, conversion that defied thermodynamic law, efficiency that made every other engine ever built look like Stone Age technology by comparison. At 2 in the morning, her phone buzzed. Text from Brad. Got something. You need to see this. She called him immediately. It's 2 a.m. What did you find? Brad's voice carried an edge she'd never heard before, something between excitement and fear. Jake Sullivan, age 52, born in Boston. Bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from MIT summa cum laude. Master's from Stanford. After graduation, he spent 12 years at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, working on advanced propulsion systems for deep space missions. Published 14 papers on energy conversion and thrust generation. Won 2 awards for innovation. The guy was a rising star in aerospace engineering. Victoria sat up in bed, heart hammering. Every word Brad spoke was a piece falling into place, a picture emerging from fragments that had seemed meaningless until you understood how they connected. Then what the hell is he doing mopping my floors? That's where it gets strange. About 15 years ago, he just disappears. Leaves NASA, stops publishing, drops off the professional grid completely. No employment records, no conference appearances, nothing. Then 4 years ago, he shows up at Hayes Aerospace applying for a janitor position with a completely fabricated background that lists him as a high school dropout. Someone with those credentials doesn't just become a janitor. Not unless they are hiding. Not unless they have a reason to disappear. Brad's pause suggested he was weighing whether to say what came next. There's more. I found an old news article from 15 years ago, right before Sullivan left NASA. His wife died. Cancer. Her name was Sarah Sullivan. She was also an engineer, worked in the private sector. The article mentions they'd been collaborating on some kind of advanced propulsion system together, something about energy recycling and regenerative thrust. But there's nothing else, no patents filed, no follow-up research. It's like the whole project just vanished. Victoria's mind raced, connecting pieces that Brad couldn't see because he didn't know what she knew, hadn't stood in that parking lot and heard that impossible sound, hadn't seen the look in Jake's eyes when he'd walked away. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just sadness. Deep, bone-tired sadness that came from carrying weight too heavy to bear alone. Send me everything you found. Every article, every paper, every record. I want it all. Victoria, it's the middle of the night. Maybe we should... Now. She hung up and stood at her bedroom window looking down at San Francisco spread below her, like a circuit board. All lights and connections and power flowing through pathways most people never saw or understood. Her father had taught her that success in business came from seeing what others missed, from understanding that every system had hidden mechanisms that determined how things really worked beneath the surface appearance. Jake Sullivan had been hiding in her building for 4 years, working beside people who never noticed him, never questioned him, never looked past the gray coveralls to see who he really was. And all that time he'd been driving that car, that impossible car, with an engine that shouldn't exist, parking it in her lot where anyone could see it, but nobody understood what they were looking at. The files arrived at 2:47 a.m. Victoria read through everything Brad had sent her, bourbon finally consumed as she absorbed details of a life she'd never imagined. Jake Sullivan's academic record was exceptional, top of his class at MIT, breakthrough research at Stanford on energy conversion efficiency, rapid advancement at NASA, where his work on ion propulsion systems had contributed to 3 successful deep space missions. The man had been brilliant, connected, on track for a career that would have made him one of the most important figures in aerospace engineering. Then Sarah got sick. The articles about her death were sparse, clinical, in the way local news coverage always was when dealing with personal tragedy that didn't involve scandal or celebrity. Sarah Sullivan, 41, lost her battle with ovarian cancer, survived by her husband Jake. Memorial service at a community center in Pasadena. Donations requested to cancer research in lieu of flowers. Nothing about the propulsion system they'd been developing. Nothing about revolutionary technology or stolen patents or destroyed careers. But Victoria knew how to read between lines, how to see what wasn't said as much as what was. The timing was too perfect. Sarah died. Jake disappeared. The propulsion research vanished. Something had happened that forced a brilliant engineer into hiding, into abandoning everything he'd built, into becoming invisible in the one industry where he should have been famous. She opened a new search looking for Hayes Aerospace patents filed around that time period. Her father's company had been smaller, then still focused primarily on aviation components, rather than the aerospace empire it would become. She filtered by propulsion systems, by energy conversion, by anything that might connect to what Jake and Sarah had been working on. There. Patent application filed 14 years and 7 months ago. Applicant Hayes Aerospace Technologies. Inventors listed William Hayes and a team of engineers whose names Victoria didn't recognize. Title: Regenerative Thrust System with Closed-Loop Energy Recapture. The abstract described a propulsion mechanism that recycled its own energy output, creating a self-sustaining power cycle that could theoretically operate without continuous external fuel input. Victoria read the patent 3 times, technical language washing over her as she tried to understand what it meant, what it implied, what it revealed about her father and his company, and the foundation everything had been built upon. The filing date was 6 months after Sarah Sullivan's death, 6 months after Jake had disappeared from NASA. She pulled up more patents, found another one filed 8 months after Sarah died. Harmonic energy distribution and regenerative propulsion systems. Another 10 months later, thermal management for closed-loop thrust generation. All of them filed under Hayes Aerospace. All of them listing William Hayes and his engineers as inventors. None of them mentioning Jake or Sarah Sullivan. Her hands were shaking. Victoria set down her phone and walked to the bathroom, splashing cold water on her face, looking at herself in the mirror. Blonde hair loose around her shoulders, eyes red from lack of sleep, skin pale in fluorescent light. She looked like someone who just discovered something they wished they could unknown, like someone standing at a crossroads where every direction led somewhere they didn't want to go. Her father had built Hayes Aerospace on those patents. The regenerative propulsion systems had been the breakthrough that allowed the company to win contracts with Boeing and Lockheed Martin and the Department of Defense. Those contracts had generated the capital to expand into satellite systems and deep space components. Everything Victoria had inherited, everything she'd spent 7 years trying to prove she deserved all of it, traced back to technology her father had claimed as his own 14 years ago, right after 2 engineers had lost everything. She didn't want to believe it, didn't want to accept that William Hayes, her father, the man who taught her about integrity and excellence and the responsibility that came with power, didn't want to accept that he could have stolen from people who were grieving, who were vulnerable, who had no way to fight back. But the timeline was too perfect. The patents were too specific. And Jake Sullivan was driving around in a car with an engine that sounded like nothing else on Earth, an engine that suggested he and Sarah had actually built what those patents described, had made it work when her father's engineers never could. Victoria returned to her bedroom and pulled up one more search. News articles about Hayes Aerospace from 14 to 15 years ago. She found them scattered across business journals and trade publications, stories about William Hayes's unexpected pivot into advanced propulsion, about breakthrough patents that positioned a mid-sized company for major aerospace contracts, about a visionary leader who saw the future before anyone else. One article quoted him directly, words she could almost hear in his voice. Innovation requires vision and determination. You have to be willing to take risks that others won't take to pursue ideas that seem impossible until someone makes them real. The hypocrisy burned. Her father had taken risks, all right, risks with other people's work, other people's dreams, other people's lives. He'd pursued ideas that seemed impossible because he'd stolen them from people who'd already made them real. Dawn broke over San Francisco while Victoria sat at her desk, surrounded by evidence of a crime she couldn't prove and a betrayal she couldn't escape. Her father was dead. Jake and Sarah's work had been buried for 14 years. And now Jake was here working in her building, driving that car in her parking lot, waiting for something Victoria was only beginning to understand. She called Brad at 6:15 a.m. His voice was thick with sleep and probably resentment at being woken for the second time in one night. Victoria, I just went to bed. I need surveillance footage. Every camera in the parking lot. I want to see what Jake does with that car when no one's watching. Brad's hesitation suggested he was weighing the request against whatever remained of his ethical boundaries or his need for sleep. You want me to spy on the janitor? I want you to do your job. Get me that footage. Today. She hung up before he could argue, standing at her window as sunrise painted the city in shades of orange and gold, light spreading across buildings that looked clean and new in early morning glow, hiding all the dirt and corruption and compromise that happened in shadows. Silicon Valley ran on innovation and disruption, on destroying old systems and building new ones, on the romantic notion that smart people with good ideas could change the world. But what happened when the smart people with good ideas had everything stolen from them? What happened when the system they tried to change destroyed them instead? What happened when the people celebrating innovation were actually celebrating theft? Victoria had no answers. She only had footage arriving at 6:00 p.m. that evening, delivered to her office on a secure drive while the building emptied for the weekend. She locked her door and watched a lone computer screen, casting blue light across her face as cameras showed her what had been happening in her parking lot for the past month. The first clips were unremarkable. Jake arriving each morning at 5:30, parking the Mustang in the far corner, same spot every day. Walking into the building with a lunchbox and a thermos, shoulders bent face down and visible. Nothing unusual, but the later footage was different. Jake leaving each night at 11:00 p.m., 3 hours after his shift officially ended. He didn't go straight to his car. Instead, he walked to the trunk, opened it, pulled out a small toolbox. Then he popped the hood and disappeared into the engine compartment. Victoria leaned closer to the screen. The camera angle wasn't ideal, but she could see enough. Jake adjusting components, connecting wires, checking gauges on some kind of handheld device that displayed readouts she couldn't decipher. This wasn't casual maintenance. This was engineering. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing, who worked with the precision that came from deep expertise, who treated that rusted car like it was the most important thing in the world. She fast-forwarded through 3 weeks of footage. Same pattern every night. Jake stayed late, worked on the engine for 2 or 3 hours, then drove home. Nobody noticed because nobody was there. Nobody cared because nobody understood what they were seeing. He was just the janitor. He was just furniture. Then Victoria found it. Footage from 11 days ago, timestamp showing 11:47 p.m. Jake disconnected something from the engine, a fuel line maybe, though she couldn't be certain from the angle. He stepped back, got in the car, started it. The engine ran. The camera didn't capture sound, but Victoria could imagine it based on what she'd heard that afternoon. That perfect, impossible harmonic. That smooth, sustained note. The engine ran for 10 minutes with no fuel line connected. 10 minutes of operation without external energy input. 10 minutes of proof that everything in those patents her father had filed was real, was possible, was actually functioning in a rusted Mustang in her parking lot. Jake shut down the engine, reconnected the fuel line, closed, the hood, drove away. The cameras captured him leaving the lot at 12:03 a.m., taillights disappearing into darkness, carrying a secret that could change everything. Victoria paused the video. Her hands were shaking. The implications cascaded through her mind like dominoes falling. If the engine worked, if the technology was real, if Jake had been perfecting it for 14 years, while her father's stolen patents sat in archives unused because nobody at Hayes Aerospace could make them functional, then everything she believed about her company's success was built on a lie. But more than that, if Jake was here, working in her building, maintaining his invisibility while driving that car in her parking lot every single day for 4 years, then he wanted something. He was waiting for something. And Victoria had just given it to him by humiliating him in front of 50 people, by forcing him to reveal what he'd been hiding, by pushing him to start that engine and let the world hear what should have stayed secret. She'd walked right into whatever trap he'd been setting, and she didn't even know what the trap was yet. The weekend passed in fragments of research and bourbon and sleepless nights. Victoria pulled every file Hayes Aerospace had on propulsion systems, reading through technical documents she barely understood, looking for any mention of Jake or Sarah Sullivan, finding nothing but the patents her father had claimed. She searched for legal records, for lawsuits, for any indication that Jake had tried to fight back when his technology was stolen. Nothing. It was as if Jake and Sarah had simply disappeared after she died, as if they'd chosen to vanish rather than fight, as if they'd decided that some battles weren't worth the cost. Monday morning arrived cold and gray. October rain washing the parking lot clean, making everything look new and temporary and fragile. Victoria sat in her office at 7:00 a.m., coffee untouched, staring at her phone, knowing what she had to do and hating every part of it. She called HR. "I need Jake Sullivan in my office, now." The HR director's voice carried professional caution. "Ms. Hayes, Jake is scheduled to start his shift at 8:00. Perhaps we could. Now, I don't care if you have to call him at home and tell him to come in early. I want him in my office in the next 30 minutes. She hung up before receiving confirmation, standing at her window, watching rain stream down glass, distorting the view, until everything outside looked fluid and uncertain. This was the moment. This was when she'd either discover the truth or commit to maintaining a lie. Either way, there was no going back. Jake arrived at 7:28, still wearing street clothes, jeans, and a worn jacket, work boots that had seen better years. He stood near her office door like he was ready to flee at any moment, hands in pockets, shoulders tight. This close, Victoria could see details she'd never noticed before. Gray streaking through dark hair, lines around his eyes that spoke of stress more than age, hands scarred from burns or cuts, or the particular damage that came from working with machinery that could hurt you if you weren't careful. Sit down. Jake didn't move. His voice came quiet but firm. I'd rather stand. Please. The word felt strange in her mouth, this small surrender of power, this acknowledgement that she was asking rather than commanding. Jake studied her for a long moment, some kind of calculation happening behind dark eyes, then slowly lowered himself into the chair across from her desk. Victoria had rehearsed this conversation all weekend. She'd prepared questions and strategies and approaches designed to extract information while maintaining control. Now sitting across from someone who'd been invisible for 4 years, all her preparation felt hollow. I did some research on you, MIT, Stanford, NASA. You were a propulsion engineer. A good one from what I can tell. Jake's expression didn't change. That was a long time ago. Not that long. 15 years isn't ancient history, Jake. You could have worked anywhere after NASA. SpaceX would have hired you in a heartbeat. Boeing, Lockheed, Blue Origin. Hell, you could have started your own company. Why are you here pushing a mop around my building? I needed a job. Don't insult my intelligence. You have credentials that could get you six-figure positions anywhere in this industry. Instead, you're earning minimum wage doing manual labor under a fake identity. Why? Jake leaned back in his chair and something flickered in his eyes. Not fear exactly, but wariness. The look of someone who'd been cornered before and learned to be careful. Maybe I like the peace and quiet. Maybe I got tired of chasing ambition and decided simple work was enough. Victoria leaned forward across her desk, voice dropping to something harder. You're hiding something. That car of yours, that engine, I've heard engines from Ferrari, from Lamborghini, from military jets that can break the sound barrier. I've never heard anything like what came out of your Mustang. Never. For the first time, emotion crossed Jake's face. Not anger, but something more complex, resignation maybe, or the weariness that came from carrying secrets too long. It's just an old car. Then you won't mind selling it to me. Silence filled the office like water rising. Victoria let it build, watching Jake's face looking for cracks in whatever armor he'd constructed around himself. When he spoke again, his voice was very quiet. It's not for sale. $50,000. Today. More than that car is worth by any measure. No, 100,000. No, Jake stood up slowly. I should get back to work. $200,000. Victoria's voice rose despite her best efforts to maintain control. $200,000 for a rusted piece of junk with a strange engine. Nobody says no to that kind of money. Nobody. Jake turned to face her fully. The exhaustion in his eyes was replaced by something else, now, something sharp and angry and long suppressed. You really don't understand, do you? His voice came out quiet, but it cut through the space between them with precision honed by years of hurt. You see that car, and you think asset. You think opportunity. You think something you can acquire and profit from. But that's not what it is. That car is all I have left of my wife. Every time I turn that key, I hear her voice. Every mile I drive, I feel her beside me. You can't buy that, not for 200,000, not for 200 million. Victoria felt something twist in her chest, an emotion she couldn't quite name but recognized as uncomfortable guilt, maybe, or shame, or the particular discomfort of realizing you'd been wrong about something fundamental. Everyone has a price, Jake. That's how the world works. No. He shook his head slowly, and Victoria saw something in his expression that looked almost like pity. Everyone doesn't. Some things are sacred. Some things matter more than money, more than success, more than everything you've built here. But you wouldn't understand that, would you? You've never lost anything that couldn't be replaced. The words landed like blows. Victoria opened her mouth to respond, to defend herself, to reassert control over a conversation that had slipped away from her completely. But Jake was already walking toward the door, already leaving, already finished with whatever this interaction had been. He stopped at the threshold without turning around. I know who your father was. I know what he did, what he built, and I know what he destroyed to build it. Victoria's blood went cold. What are you talking about? But Jake was already gone, door swinging shut behind him, leaving her alone with implications she didn't want to examine and truths she didn't want to face. The rest of Monday passed in a fog. Victoria sat through meetings she barely heard, but approved budgets. She didn't read, responded to emails with words that felt automatic and empty. Her mind kept returning to Jake's face when he talked about his wife, to the pain that had been raw and real, and still bleeding after 15 years, to the accusation in his final words before leaving. I know what your father destroyed. That night, Victoria stood in her penthouse and thought about William Hayes. Brilliant, ruthless, capable of great kindness and great cruelty. Those words Richard Morrison had used to describe him, and Victoria had never questioned them because they felt true. Her father had been complicated, had contained multitudes, had been human in all the contradictory ways humans could be. But what if complicated was just another word for corrupt? What if multitudes meant hiding sins behind charity? What if human meant capable of theft and betrayal and destroying people's lives when it served his purposes? Victoria poured bourbon, she didn't drink, and watched city lights spread below her, thinking about Jake Sullivan mopping her floors while driving a car that contained technology worth billions, maintaining his invisibility while carrying knowledge that could topple everything she'd built. 4 years he'd waited. 4 years he'd endured humiliation and obscurity and the particular indignity of being furniture in the world that should have celebrated him. Why, what was he waiting for? What did he want? The answer came to her slowly emerging from connections she'd been too blind to see. Jake wasn't waiting for revenge. He wasn't planning some dramatic confrontation. He was waiting for someone to see, waiting for someone to notice. Waiting for the person who'd inherited William Hayes's empire to discover what her father had done and make a choice about who she wanted to be. And Victoria had failed that test. She'd seen the engine and thought opportunity. She'd discovered Jake's credentials and thought threat. She'd offered money because that was the only currency she understood, the only way she knew how to solve problems, or acquire things, or navigate a world where everything had a price. Jake had been right. She'd never lost anything that couldn't be replaced. Money, position, even the company, all of it was replaceable because all of it was external, built on foundations someone else had laid, inherited rather than earned. She'd never built something with her own hands, never created something that existed only because she'd made it exist, never understood what it meant to pour yourself into work that mattered more than profit or success or legacy. The decision came to her at 3:00 a.m. while she stood at her window, sleepless and sick with understanding she couldn't escape. If Jake wouldn't sell the car, if he wouldn't give her what she wanted, if he insisted on maintaining his invisible presence in her building while carrying secrets that could destroy everything, then she'd eliminate the problem. She'd fire him, remove him from Hayes Aerospace, get him out of her building, off her property, away from her people. If he wasn't an employee, he couldn't hurt her company. If he wasn't there every day reminding her of questions she didn't want to answer, she could go back to running her business and forget about engines that shouldn't exist and fathers who might have been thieves. It was cowardice, and she knew it. But knowing didn't stop her from picking up her phone and texting Brad, "Fire Jake Sullivan. I want him gone by end of day tomorrow. Have security escort him out. Make sure he doesn't take anything from the building." Brad's response came immediately, surprising for 3:00 a.m. On what grounds? Victoria stared at the question for a long moment before typing, "I don't need grounds. I'm the CEO. Make it happen." Tuesday morning arrived, gray and cold rain still falling, October sliding toward November, with the particular melancholy that came with shortening days and dying light. Victoria arrived at her office at 6:00 a.m., coffee, untouched mind, racing through justifications and rationalizations, and all the small lies she told herself to make the decision feel necessary rather than cruel. Jake Sullivan was a liability. He was operating under false pretenses. He represented unknown risk to company security. All of it was technically true. None of it was the real reason she wanted him gone. The real reason was that looking at him made her see things she didn't want to see. made her question things she'd accepted her entire life, made her wonder if the empire her father had built was worth celebrating or worth burning down. Brad appeared at her door at 9:47, looking uncomfortable in the way of people who'd been ordered to do something they disagreed with, but lacked the courage to refuse. It's done. Security's escorting him out now. Victoria nodded without speaking, turning to her window, watching rain streak glass, not wanting to see Brad's face, not wanting to acknowledge what she'd just done. Behind her, she heard him leave, door closing with soft finality. She stood at that window for 20 minutes, paralyzed by something between guilt and relief, knowing she should feel one or the other more strongly, but finding herself suspended between them. Then movement caught her eye. Security guards crossing the parking lot below, Jake Sullivan between them, no longer wearing gray coveralls but street clothes, again shoulders straight rather than bent, walking with the measured pace of someone who'd expected this, who'd prepared for it, who'd known all along that this moment was coming. Victoria pressed her hand against cold glass, watching three figures move through rain toward that rusted Mustang. She could see it from here, could trace its outline against wet asphalt, could remember the sound it had made 3 days ago when Jake had started the engine and announced to everyone who had ears that impossible things were possible if you were brave enough, or desperate enough, or brilliant enough to make them real. Jake reached the car. Security guards stood back as he opened the door, as he settled into the driver's seat, as he turned the key one final time. Victoria couldn't hear the engine from 42 floors up, couldn't hear that perfect harmonic through glass and distance and rain, but she remembered it, God. She remembered it the way it had rolled across the parking lot like thunder, like music, like everything she'd been taught was impossible made suddenly undeniably real. Then Jake drove away, taillights disappearing through the gate, leaving Hayes Aerospace behind, leaving Victoria alone with the weight of what she'd done and the knowledge of what she'd lost and the growing certainty that she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. She thought it was over. She thought removing Jake would make the problem disappear, would let her return to running her company and forget about engines and accusations and the uncomfortable questions that kept her awake at night. She had no idea that she'd just lit a fuse that had been waiting 15 years to burn, that she'd just triggered events that would unravel everything she thought she knew about herself and her father and the empire they'd built on foundations she'd never examined too closely. 6 days passed. Victoria tried to return to normal board meetings and investor calls and strategic planning sessions that felt hollow but necessary. She tried not to think about Jake Sullivan or his impossible engine or the look in his eyes when he talked about his dead wife. She tried to convince herself that firing him had been the right decision, the smart decision, the only decision that made sense from a business perspective. She failed. Every night that engine sound replayed in her mind. Every morning she woke wondering where Jake had gone and what he was doing and whether he'd simply disappeared again or whether something else was coming, something she couldn't predict or control or stop. The answer came on the 6th day at 3:40 a.m. when her phone rang and Patricia Reeves's voice came through tight with urgency. Victoria, turn on the news, Channel 4. Right now, Victoria fumbled for the remote, heart-hammering knowing before the screen flickered to life that whatever she was about to see would change everything. The image resolved: small press conference, modest production, simple backdrop. And at the center, looking different than he had 6 days ago, stood Jake Sullivan, clean-shaven, wearing a simple suit, eyes clear and focused, all the exhaustion replaced by something else. Something that looked like purpose, like determination, like a man who'd been waiting 15 years for this exact moment. His voice came through her speakers, calm and measured and absolutely certain. I'm pleased to announce that Aurora Dynamics has received federal funding of $22 million for the development of our clean energy propulsion system. This technology, which my late wife Sarah and I developed together over 15 years ago, has the potential to revolutionize not just aerospace, but transportation as a whole. Victoria stopped breathing. The remote fell from her hand, clattering against hardwood floor, forgotten. On screen, Jake continued his voice, filling her bedroom like prophecy, like judgment, like the future arriving ahead of schedule. The Aurora engine is a self-sustaining power system that recycles its own energy output. In laboratory conditions, our prototype has run continuously for 72 hours without any external fuel source. We believe this technology can reduce carbon emissions in aviation by up to 90%, while simultaneously increasing efficiency and reducing operating costs. Reporters erupted with questions, voices overlapping in urgency. One cut through louder than the rest. "Mr. Sullivan, is it true that this technology was stolen from you 15 years ago?" Jake paused. Something shifted in his expression, some old wound opening fresh. "There will be a time to discuss the history of this technology. For now, I want to focus on the future and what the Aurora engine can do for the world. My wife believed this technology could help people. That's what matters. That's what I'm here to honor." The screen cut to reporters analyzing the announcement, experts weighing in on implications, stock tickers showing Hayes Aerospace dropping 3% in after-hours trading. Victoria muted the television and sat in darkness, trembling, mind racing through everything that had just happened and everything it meant. 22 million in federal funding, a technology that could make her entire company obsolete. Jake Sullivan, the janitor she'd humiliated and fired, now the face of the future, vindicated and validated, and carrying the proof that everything her father had built was stolen from people who couldn't fight back. But it was that reporter's question that made her blood run cold, that made her understand fully what Jake had been doing for 4 years while mopping her floors. He'd been building a case. He'd been gathering evidence. He'd been waiting for the right moment to reveal that Hayes Aerospace, the empire her father had built, the legacy she'd inherited, all of it was founded on theft. Victoria picked up her phone with hands that wouldn't stop shaking and dialed Richard Morrison. He'd been her father's oldest friend, had been there at the beginning, had helped William Hayes build the company from nothing. If anyone knew the truth, it would be him. He answered on the third ring, voice thick with sleep and probably bourbon. "Victoria, do you know what time it is? Tell me about Jake Sullivan." Silence stretched across the line like a wound opening. Victoria gripped the phone so hard her knuckles turned white. "Richard, tell me about Jake Sullivan. Tell me what my father did." More silence. Then a long, heavy sigh that carried the weight of years and regret and secrets that had festered too long in darkness. "How much do you know?" "I know Jake worked at NASA. I know he had a wife who died. I know he developed a technology that someone stole from him 15 years ago. What I need to know is whether that someone was my father." The silence that followed felt like it would never end, like time had stopped, like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for an answer Victoria both needed and dreaded. When Richard finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. "I think you better come to my house. There are some files your father left with me, files he never wanted you to see." Victoria drove through pre-dawn darkness, the highway empty except for delivery trucks and insomniacs, her Mercedes cutting through rain that hadn't stopped since Jake's termination. Richard Morrison's mansion sprawled across 2 acres in Atherton, the kind of property that declared wealth without announcing it, old money preferring privacy to spectacle. She'd been here countless times as a child, running through gardens, while her father and Richard discussed business over cigars and whiskey, never imagining that those discussions might include decisions that would haunt her decades later. Richard opened the door before she could knock, 81 years old, wearing a bathrobe that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, eyes sharp despite the hour. He'd aged since her father's funeral, holders more stooped, skin more papery, the inevitable erosion of time. But his gaze carried the same intensity she remembered from childhood, the look of someone who missed nothing and forgot less. He led her through hallways lined with art her father had helped him acquire, into a study that smelled of leather and old wood and secrets kept too long. A manila folder sat on the desk between 2 chairs, positioned as if Richard had been expecting this conversation for years, just waiting for Victoria to arrive and ask the right questions. "Your father was a complicated man, brilliant, ruthless, capable of great kindness and great cruelty, sometimes in the same breath." Victoria remained standing, too wired with adrenaline and dread to sit. "Did he steal the Aurora engine?" Richard lowered himself into one of the chairs with the careful movements of age joints protesting. "Steal is a strong word." He handed her the folder. "But yes, in essence, yes." The folder was heavier than it should have been, as if the papers inside had absorbed weight from the secrets they contained. Victoria opened it with hands that trembled, despite her best efforts at control. Inside, legal documents, patent applications, internal memos, and at the bottom a handwritten letter in her father's unmistakable script, precise, businesslike, completely devoid of sentiment. She read standing up, unable to sit, unable to process what each page revealed, except to move to the next. driven by the same compulsion that made people stare at accidents, that made them unable to look away from disasters even when every instinct screamed to run. 15 minutes later, she looked up. Her face had gone pale. He destroyed them. Jake and Sarah came to my father for funding, for partnership, and he took everything. Richard reached across the desk, took her hand, with fingers gnarled by arthritis and age. He saw an opportunity, a young couple with no money, no connections, no way to defend themselves, and technology that could be worth billions. Your father was many things, Victoria, but sentimental wasn't one of them. Victoria stared at the letter in her hands, her father's handwriting, clear and damning. Acquired Sullivan thermal regeneration patents. Legal team estimates settlement cost at $2.3 million to suppress all claims, worth billions in long-term applications. Sullivan will never recover financially or professionally. Project Aurora terminated. Technology secured. Clinical, efficient, monstrous in its casual destruction of 2 lives. She found more documents. Patent applications filed in Hayes Aerospace's name 6 months after Sarah's death. Legal threats sent to Jake Sullivan, warning of frivolous litigation if he challenged ownership. Cease and desist letters drafted by attorneys billing $800 per hour. A paper trail documenting systematic theft dressed up as business strategy. I mocked him. I humiliated him in front of the whole company. I fired him. Victoria's voice came out hollow, scraped, raw. And the whole time he knew. He knew what my father did, and he never said a word. Richard squeezed her hand gently. The question now is, what are you going to do about it? Victoria looked at the folder, at the evidence of her family's betrayal, at the truth she could no longer escape or ignore or rationalize away. For the first time in her life, she had absolutely no idea what to do. No strategic plan, no clear path forward. She was standing at a crossroads where every direction led somewhere she didn't want to go, faced with a choice between the person she'd been and the person she might become. The sun rose through Richard's study windows while she sat there reading every document over and over, looking for some detail that might change what it all meant, finding nothing but confirmation that her inheritance was built on stolen dreams and destroyed lives. Richard appeared around 6 with coffee she barely tasted. Dawn light made the study seem different, warmer, less oppressive, as if morning could wash away the stains of what had happened in darkness 15 years ago. You should get some sleep. How did you live with this, all these years knowing what he did? Richard's expression carried the particular sadness of someone who'd made peace with compromises they wished they'd refused. Your father was my best friend for 40 years. I loved him like a brother, but I never said I was proud of everything he did. Some things I watched happen and said nothing, because stopping him seemed impossible, because the damage was already done, because I was a coward. He paused, looking out the window at grounds maintained by gardeners who arrived before dawn and left after sunset, at beauty built on wealth that might have come from questionable sources. That's my sin to carry. Don't make it yours. Victoria stood abruptly, the folder clutched against her chest. The technology in those patents, the Aurora engine, it's real. I've seen it, heard it. Jake has been driving it around for 15 years in that old Mustang. It works. It could change everything. Aviation, transportation, energy, infrastructure. Worth billions. She turned to Richard, desperate for answers he couldn't provide. Why didn't my father ever use it? Why steal something and let it sit in archives for 14 years? He couldn't make it work. Richard's answer came quiet but definitive. Your father had his engineers study those patents for years after he acquired them. They built prototype after prototype. Nothing performed like what Jake and Sarah had described. The blueprints were incomplete. The Sullivans had kept critical components in their heads, details that couldn't be reverse engineered from documents alone. Without their cooperation, the technology was useless. So he stole something he couldn't even use. He stole it so no one else could use it. That was enough for him, denying that advantage to competitors controlling a space he couldn't occupy himself. Classic William Hayes strategy. Victoria walked to the window, watching gardeners move across the lawn with practiced efficiency, thinking about all the people who worked invisibly to maintain systems they didn't control, who kept machinery running for others' benefit, who understood intimately how things worked while receiving none of the recognition. I need that engine, not just for the company, for everything. Clean energy for the entire aviation industry, reduced emissions, sustainable transportation. This isn't just about money anymore. Richard studied her face with an expression that suggested he was looking for something specific, some indication of who she really was beneath the inheritance and title and assumptions. Is that really why you want it? Or is it because you can't stand the thought that a janitor has something you don't? The question hit like a slap. Victoria wanted to deny it, wanted to claim noble intentions and humanitarian goals and visionary leadership. But something in Richard's eyes made lying impossible, made her see herself with the same clarity that had revealed her father's sins. I don't know. I honestly don't know what I want anymore. I just know I can't let this go. Richard nodded slowly, understanding or judgment, she couldn't tell which. Then I suppose you'd better figure out who you really are before you do something you can't take back. Your father spent his whole life taking things from people who couldn't fight back. He died rich and powerful and completely alone with a daughter who loved him but never really knew him. Is that the legacy you want to continue? Victoria left as dawn solidified into morning, driving back to San Francisco with the folder beside her, evidence of crimes that couldn't be prosecuted because the perpetrator was dead and the statute of limitations had expired, and justice was a luxury afforded only to people with resources to pursue it. The city woke around her as she crossed the bridge, delivery trucks and early commuters and joggers chasing endorphins before another day of work they might love or hate or simply endure. She didn't go to Hayes Aerospace, didn't go to her penthouse. Instead, she drove to a storage facility in Menlo Park, rented the largest unit available with a credit card she'd rarely used, and started making calls. Patricia Reeves answered on the third ring, voice thick with sleep and confusion. Victoria, it's 6:45 in the morning. I need equipment, machine tools, diagnostic systems, everything we use for prototype development. I need it delivered to a storage unit in Menlo Park. Silence stretched across the line, broken only by what sounded like coffee being poured. The board is meeting in 3 hours. They're going to vote you out officially, make the termination formal. You have to be there to defend yourself. No, I don't. Victoria's voice came out clearer than she expected, steadier, as if the decision was forming even as she spoke it. I'm done defending who I was. I'm going to become someone worth defending instead. Send me the equipment, Patricia. I'll pay for it myself. This isn't Hayes Aerospace business, it's mine. She hung up before Dr. Reeves could argue, before doubt could creep in and undermine the strange clarity she felt. Over the next 6 hours, Victoria transformed the storage unit into a workshop. She maxed out 3 credit cards buying parts and materials. She downloaded software and watched tutorial videos and read technical manuals until her eyes burned and her head ached with information she'd never needed before. How to weld aluminum, how to wire circuit boards, how to calibrate diagnostic instruments, how to work with her hands instead of just signing papers and attending meetings. At 2 in the afternoon, her phone buzzed with a news alert. Hayes Aerospace Board removes CEO Victoria Hayes in unanimous vote. Stock drops 7% on leadership uncertainty. She read the headline, set down her phone, and got back to work. The board could have the company. They could have her office and her title and her corner views of the Bay Area. She was building something else now, something that belonged to her alone. The binder Jake had given her became her Bible. She'd found it in the Mustang's trunk that first night after leaving Richard's house, her mind racing with desperate plans. If she couldn't have Jake's cooperation, maybe she could steal the binder, learn his secrets, replicate the technology without him. She'd return to Hayes Aerospace at midnight, bypass security with her executive access that hadn't been revoked yet, found the Mustang in the employee lot because Jake was still technically employed for another 12 hours. The binder had been in the trunk, wrapped in plastic, protected from moisture and time. She'd taken it without permission, without asking, driven by the same impulse that had made her father steal patents and destroy careers. The belief that wanting something badly enough justified taking it. Now sitting on concrete floor in a storage unit that smelled of motor oil and possibility, Victoria opened the binder and saw Sarah's handwriting for the first time. For Jake, for our future, for everyone who needs light in the darkness. The words hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just engineering, this was love made tangible, hope converted to mathematics, faith that the universe could be better if humans were wise enough and brave enough and generous enough to build systems that served rather than exploited. Everything her father had never understood. Everything Victoria was only beginning to grasp. She turned the page and started reading. The mathematics were brutal layers of complexity that built on themselves like waves, each equation creating conditions for the next. Sarah and Jake hadn't just designed an engine, they'd created a philosophy of energy, a new way of thinking about power and motion, and the fundamental relationship between input and output. By 3 in the morning, Victoria's head pounded. She'd filled half a legal pad with notes, most of them questions she couldn't answer. The Chinese restaurant down the street had closed hours ago. The truck stop where she showered had locked its bathrooms for the night. She was alone with Sarah's handwriting and Jake's diagrams and the growing understanding that this technology was so far beyond anything she'd studied that attempting to recreate it was probably insane. She kept reading. Around 5, she found a section labeled Core Principles in Jake's handwriting. The Aurora engine is not about creating energy from nothing that's impossible. It's about respect, respecting the energy that already exists, capturing what would otherwise be lost, treating waste as opportunity. Sarah always said the universe doesn't have a scarcity problem. It has a wisdom problem. We throw away more than we use. The Aurora changes that. Victoria read those words 3 times, her tired brain struggling to process what they meant, not just technically, but philosophically. Respecting energy that already exists, treating waste as opportunity. She thought about her own life, the energy she'd wasted on appearances and competition, improving herself to people whose approval meant nothing. The opportunities she'd thrown away because they didn't fit her image of success. The relationships she'd burned because maintaining them required effort she wasn't willing to give. She'd been living like a wasteful engine, losing more than she used, letting everything valuable slip through her fingers while chasing metrics that didn't measure anything real. The first prototype took 8 days to build. Victoria's hands, so accustomed to signing documents and shaking hands at cocktail parties, developed blisters that burst and bled and reformed as calluses. She burned herself twice with the soldering iron. She hit her thumb with a hammer hard enough to turn the nail black. She spent one entire night crying in frustration when a circuit board she'd assembled over 12 hours turned out to be wired backward, completely useless, a testament to her incompetence. But she kept going. She slept on an air mattress in the corner of the storage unit. She ate takeout from the Chinese place when she remembered to eat it all. She showered at the truck stop 3 blocks away, avoiding mirrors because seeing herself hair unwashed, skin pale, eyes red-rimmed, meant confronting how far she'd fallen from the polished executive who'd run a $4 billion company 6 weeks ago. On day 8, she connected the power cell to her prototype with hands that trembled from exhaustion and fear and desperate hope. She'd followed Sarah's diagrams, exactly double-checked every connection, verified every specification. It should work. It had to work. She needed it to work with an intensity that went beyond ambition or pride into something more primal, the need to prove she could build instead of just create, instead of just inherit, earn, instead of just possess. She turned on the prototype. It ran for 4 seconds before the energy loop collapsed and the whole system overheated, smoke rising from components that had cost $3,000 and represented 80 hours of work. Victoria sat on concrete floor, staring at the wreckage, feeling failure settle into her bones alongside exhaustion and hunger, and the dawning understanding that this might be impossible, that she might not be smart enough or skilled enough or worthy enough to achieve what Sarah and Jake had spent 7 years perfecting. She went back to the binder, read the section on energy loop stabilization 3 more times, found a notation in Sarah's handwriting. She'd missed before the key is patience. The system needs time to find its rhythm. Don't force it, guide it. Don't force it, guide it. Victoria thought about how she'd lived her entire life, forcing, demanding, taking, pushing, never guiding, never waiting, never trusting anything to develop at its own pace. She'd forced her way through business school, forced her rise through Hayes Aerospace's ranks, forced employees to meet impossible deadlines, forced herself to be the daughter her father wanted, rather than discovering who she actually was. She rebuilt the prototype, took her time, paid attention to the rhythm Sarah had described. When she connected the power cell again, she didn't slam the switch. She eased it, gently coaxing rather than commanding, guiding rather than controlling. The engine ran for 30 seconds, then 45, then a minute and 12 seconds before it failed. Progress. 3 weeks into her exile, Richard Morrison found her. He stood in the doorway of the storage unit, staring at the chaos inside scattered tools, failed prototypes, the sleeping bag in the corner. The woman who had run a $4 billion company, now wearing stained coveralls with hair pulled back in a ponytail, held together with a rubber band. My God, Victoria, what have you done to yourself? She didn't look up from the circuit board she was soldering. I'm learning how to destroy your life. The board has frozen your assets pending investigation. Your accounts are locked. You're living in a storage unit like you're homeless. I'm not homeless. I'm working. Richard walked closer, stepping carefully around debris on the floor. He picked up the binder, flipped through pages covered in Sarah's handwriting and Victoria's desperate notes, set it down again with the reverence due to sacred texts. He gave you this, Jake Sullivan. He's testing me. If I can build the engine, he'll know I'm serious about changing. And if you can't, Victoria finally looked up, eyes bloodshot and exhausted, but carrying something Richard had never seen before, something that looked almost like peace. Then I'll keep trying until I can. The board is talking about criminal charges. They're saying you knew about the stolen patents all along, that you orchestrated the cover-up. Securities fraud, intellectual property theft, conspiracy. You could go to prison. Let them charge me. I don't care anymore. Richard's voice rose slightly despite his usual control. You should care, Victoria. This is your life, your freedom, your future. I spent my whole life caring about the wrong things. She set down the soldering iron, giving him full attention. Stock prices, board meetings, what people thought of me, what my father thought of me. Where did it get me? I was CEO of a company built on stolen dreams and I didn't even know it. I was so busy protecting my image that I never bothered to look at what was underneath. She held up the circuit board, examining it in fluorescent light. This is real. This work, this challenge, this attempt to build something, instead of take something. Even if I fail, even if I go to prison, even if I lose everything, at least I'll know I tried to be different than him. Richard was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket, pulled out an envelope thick with cash. Before I came here, I liquidated some holdings. $80,000. It's not much, but it should keep you going for a while. Victoria stared at the envelope, then at Richard's face, seeing something there she'd never noticed before. Guilt, regret, the particular pain of someone who'd made mistakes they couldn't undo but could try to balance with different choices now. Why would you do that? Because I failed your father once. I watched him do terrible things and said nothing. I won't make the same mistake with you. He pressed the envelope into her hands. Be better than him, Victoria. That's all I ask. He walked to the door, paused without turning around. For what it's worth, I think Sarah Sullivan would have liked you. The person you're becoming, I mean, not the person you were. The breakthrough came on day 37. Victoria had rebuilt the prototype 9 times, each version running longer than the last, each failure teaching her something new about harmonics and energy flow and the delicate balance required to sustain regeneration. She'd learned to read Sarah's handwriting like a second language, to anticipate Jake's logic, to understand the philosophy behind every design choice. And finally, something clicked. It wasn't dramatic. No lightning bolt of inspiration, no sudden revelation. Just quiet understanding that had been building for weeks, pieces falling into place one by one until the whole picture became clear. The Aurora engine wasn't about dominating energy or forcing efficiency or imposing human will on natural systems. It was about harmony. Every component working with every other component, not against it. The system couldn't be forced or controlled. It had to be balanced, guided, respected. Victoria made one final adjustment to the energy flow regulator, a small change she'd overlooked dozens of times before. She connected the power cell, held her breath, turned the key. The engine started. Smooth, quiet, perfect. She watched diagnostic readouts, waiting for the collapse that always came, waiting for overheat warnings or cascade failures or any of the 100 ways the system could degrade. 5 minutes passed. 10. 20. The energy loop held, recycling its own output, feeding back into itself, sustaining motion without external fuel. It wasn't perpetual, nothing was perpetual, but it was close. Closer than anything humanity had ever built. Victoria sat on concrete floor and cried. Not from exhaustion, though she was exhausted. Not from relief, though she was relieved. She cried because she'd built something real. Something true, something that mattered beyond profit or legacy or any metric her father had ever taught her to value. And she cried because she understood now what Jake had lost when Sarah died. Not just a wife, but a partner who'd shared this vision, who'd believed in building systems that served rather than exploited, who'd poured her heart into technology that could help people if only they were brave enough to finish it. She called Jake the next morning, hands still trembling. "It works, the engine I built. It's been running for 14 hours straight." Silence on the other end stretched long enough that Victoria wondered if he'd hung up. "Did you hear me? I said I built it. I heard you." Jake's voice was strange guarded, carrying emotions Victoria couldn't identify. "You actually did it. I want to show you. I want you to see that I understand what you and Sarah created, not just the mechanics, the meaning behind it, the philosophy. I want you to know I get it now. Why does that matter to you? Because I need you to see that I'm not my father. I need someone to believe that people can change, that I can change." More silence. Then his voice came back softer but still careful. "Where are you?" She gave him the address of the storage unit. "I'll be there in 2 hours. Don't touch anything." Jake arrived exactly when he said he would, driving the Mustang that had started everything. He walked into the storage unit without speaking, eyes moving across the chaos, failed prototypes in the corner, tools scattered across workbenches, the binder lying open to a page covered in Victoria's handwritten notes trying to decode Sarah's brilliance. Then he saw the engine still running, that smooth, quiet hum filling the space like music or prayer, or proof that impossible things became possible when you refused to quit. He examined every connection, every circuit, every component with the meticulous attention of someone who understood that small mistakes could cascade into complete failure. He checked readings, ran his own diagnostics, monitored the system for degradation. 15 minutes passed in silence that felt heavier than any conversation. Finally, he turned to face Victoria. "How long did this take you?" 37 days. "And you built it alone?" "No help from anyone, just the binder and a lot of failure." Jake looked back at the engine and Victoria saw his hands trembling slightly. "This configuration, the adjustment you made to the flow regulator, it's not in the binder." Victoria nodded carefully. "I know. I figured it out on my own based on something Sarah wrote about harmony. I realized the original design had a small imbalance in the feedback loop. The change corrects it." Jake stared at her in a way that made Victoria's chest tighten. "You improved it. You actually improved our design. I didn't mean to. I was just trying to make it work." "No," Jake shook his head slowly, something like wonder creeping into his voice. "Sarah and I spent 7 years on this engine. We knew that imbalance was there but couldn't figure out how to fix it. And you found the answer in 37 days. He walked to the binder, picked it up, flipped through pages, slowly looking at Victoria's notes and calculations and questions written in margins alongside Sarah's original text. She would have liked this. Sarah. She would have liked seeing her work continue, seeing someone else understand what we were trying to do. I wish I could have met her. So do I. Jake set down the binder, turned to face Victoria fully. "You know what she told me once, right before she died? She said the Aurora engine wasn't just about energy, it was about faith. Faith that the universe gives us what we need if we're wise enough to accept it. Faith that waste can become wealth and loss can become gain." He paused, tears gathering in his eyes. "She said that someday the right person would find our work and carry it forward. Someone who understood that technology isn't about power, it's about service." Victoria felt her own tears burning. "I'm not sure I'm that person." "No, you're not. Not yet." Jake's voice was gentle now, almost kind. "But you might be becoming her. And that's more than I ever expected." He reached out his hand. Victoria stared at it, not understanding. Then Jake spoke again, and the words landed with the weight of everything that had come before. "I need a partner. Aurora Dynamics is growing faster than I can handle alone. Federal grant is just the beginning. We've got interest from airlines, from governments, from companies worldwide. I need someone who understands the technology, who believes in the mission, who has skills to navigate the business side. You want me to work with you. I want to give you a chance to prove who you are. Not your father's daughter, not the CEO who fired me, but the woman who spent 37 days in a storage unit destroying her hands and her pride just to understand what two people built out of love." Victoria looked at his hand, rough, callous, the hand of someone who'd lost everything and refused to surrender. She thought about her own hands, blistered, now scarred, transformed by work that mattered. She took his hand and shook it. "I'll work harder than anyone you've ever met. I'll do whatever it takes to earn this. I know you will. Jake released her hand, walked toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped and turned back. Shut down the engine and pack your things. You start tomorrow. He paused one more time. And Victoria, thank you for giving me the chance, for believing I could change. For the first time since she'd met him, something that might have been a smile crossed Jake's face. Don't thank me yet. The hard part is just beginning. Victoria showed up at Aurora Dynamics at 6 the next morning, 3 hours before anyone else would arrive. The converted warehouse sat in an industrial section of Oakland, where rent was cheap and neighbors didn't ask questions about machines running late into the night. Fog hung thick over streets, still dark, turning streetlights into halos, making everything soft and uncertain. She pulled her jacket tighter against the cold and sat on concrete steps outside the locked door waiting. Her Mercedes looked out of place here, gleaming luxury surrounded by pickup trucks and work vans. She'd thought about selling it, adding the money to what Richard had given her, but decided against it. The car was a reminder of who she'd been useful for maintaining perspective, for remembering that transformation was a process rather than a single decision. Sleep hadn't come last night either. Her mind kept racing through what she'd agreed to, what it meant to work for someone she'd humiliated, to build something with a man whose life her father had destroyed. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Sarah's handwriting in that binder, those careful notes filled with hope that had outlived the woman who wrote them. The Mustang pulled into the lot at 6:47 engine sound, distinctive even from a distance, that smooth harmonic that announced itself without shouting power, contained and controlled. Jake got out, stopped when he saw her on the steps. You're early. I couldn't sleep. That'll pass. He walked past her and unlocked the door. Morning light catching gray in his hair that seemed more pronounced than it had 2 months ago, as if the press conference and federal funding and sudden visibility had aged him in ways poverty and obscurity never had. Come on, I'll show you where you'll be working. The workshop looked different in early light, quieter, more intimate spaces between equipment, feeling like possibility rather than emptiness. Victoria followed Jake through the main floor past workbenches where prototypes sat in various stages of completion, past diagnostic equipment that hummed even when idle, to a small office in the back corner, barely large enough for a desk and 2 chairs. This was supposed to be a supply closet, but we needed space. You'll share it with our CFO when we hire one. Victoria looked around at the metal desk, scarred with use, the ancient computer that probably ran software from a decade ago, the single window overlooking the parking lot. The smallest office she'd ever occupied, smaller than the bathroom in her penthouse. It's perfect. Jake raised an eyebrow in a way that suggested skepticism. You used to have a corner office with views of the entire Bay Area. I used to be a lot of things. Victoria set her bag on the desk, meeting his gaze without flinching. What do you need me to do? For the next 3 months, Victoria learned what it meant to build something from nothing. She answered phones when the receptionist was overwhelmed by calls from journalists and investors and companies wanting to license technology that hadn't been proven at scale yet. She filed paperwork the government required in triplicate because federal grants came with oversight that assumed fraud until proven otherwise. She negotiated with suppliers who didn't return calls because Aurora Dynamics had no credit history and no track record and no reason to trust a startup claiming revolutionary technology. She fixed the coffee maker when it broke, unclogged the toilet, when the plumber wanted $300 just to show up, stayed late, reconciling spreadsheets because they couldn't afford an accountant yet, and someone needed to track where every dollar went. The other engineers didn't trust her at first. They'd all heard the stories: the CEO who'd mocked their boss in a parking lot, the heiress who'd tried to steal their technology. They watched her with suspicious eyes, waiting for the mask to slip, waiting for the real Victoria Hayes to emerge and reveal this whole redemption act was just another scheme. Victoria didn't blame them. She just kept working, kept showing up at 6, kept staying until midnight, kept doing whatever needed to be done without complaint or expectation of recognition. Slowly and perceptibly, the atmosphere shifted. Patricia Reeves was first appearing one evening with coffee and a circuit design problem that needed fresh eyes. David Kim followed a week later, asking Victoria's opinion on financial projections for scaling production. 6 weeks in, Marcus Webb arrived, the same Marcus who'd shown off his Mercedes at that quarterly showcase that now felt like it had happened in another lifetime. He'd left Hayes Aerospace after the board purge, after watching the company he'd believed in revealed as built on theft. Now he stood in Aurora's workshop looking uncomfortable and determined. I want to help. I'm good at what I do. Propulsion systems, energy conversion. I know you have no reason to trust me, but I'm asking anyway. Jake looked at Victoria. She'd earned that, the acknowledgement that her opinion mattered, that decisions here were made together rather than imposed from above. Everyone deserves a chance to choose who they become. Victoria spoke to Marcus, but the words were for herself too. You start Monday. One night, about 8 weeks in, Victoria was alone in the workshop running diagnostics on a new prototype iteration when Jake appeared beside her. The building was dark except for her workstation, everyone else long gone to families and lives that existed outside these walls. It's midnight, go home. I want to finish these tests. The Boeing meeting is in 3 days. The tests can wait. Jake's voice was gentle but firm. You've been here since 6 this morning. You've been here since 6 every morning for 8 weeks. When's the last time you slept more than 4 hours? Victoria tried to remember and couldn't. Days blurred together into work and exhaustion, and the constant pressure of proving herself worthy of the second chance she'd been given. Jake pulled up a chair, sat close enough that she could smell motor oil and something else that reminded her of honesty. You're going to burn out. Then you'll be useless to everyone, including yourself. I can't stop. Victoria's voice cracked despite her best efforts. Every time I slow down, I think about what I did, what my father did. I think about how many years you lost because of us, how Sarah died without seeing her work recognized. I can't just go home and pretend everything's okay. Jake was quiet for a moment. Then he started talking, voice soft in the darkness. Let me tell you something about Sarah. When she was dying, when we both knew she only had weeks left, I wanted to spend every minute at her bedside. I wanted to hold her hand and tell her I loved her and make up for all the time we'd lost fighting your father. He paused and Victoria saw something raw in his expression. You know what she said? She said if I sat there watching her die, I would die too. Not physically, but inside. She made me promise to take breaks, to eat meals, to sleep, to live. Victoria felt tears on her cheeks but didn't wipe them away. She said guilt is just another form of selfishness. When we punish ourselves, we're making everything about us, our pain, our redemption, our story. But real change isn't about punishment. It's about service. Taking the energy we'd waste on guilt and using it to help someone else. How do you do that? How do you stop feeling guilty for something that can never be fixed? You don't stop feeling it. You just learn to carry it differently. Jake stood up stretching. Like the engine, you don't eliminate waste, you transform it. You turn it into something useful. Victoria looked at the prototype on the bench, smooth curves of the housing, precise arrangement of components. Sarah's design improved by Victoria's hands, carried forward by Jake's faith. I don't know if I can do this. Be the person you need me to be. Neither do I, but I'm willing to find out. He walked toward the door, stopped halfway. Go home. Get some sleep. Come back tomorrow, ready to transform your waste into something useful. Something shifted between them that night. Not romance yet, but the foundation that would make romance possible. The understanding that they were both carrying weight too heavy to bear alone, that maybe together they could distribute the load. The Boeing meeting changed everything. Catherine Wells arrived with 3 senior engineers, all of them carrying the particular skepticism of people who'd heard too many promises about revolutionary technology that never materialized. They'd read Aurora's projections, reviewed the federal grant documentation, studied patents that showed brilliant theory, but offered no proof of practical application. We've seen your materials, impressive numbers, but numbers can be manipulated. Catherine's voice carried the weight of 32 years in aerospace. Show us something real. Jake looked at Victoria. She'd spent weeks preparing presentations and financial models and risk assessments. Now none of it mattered except the truth they could demonstrate. Follow me. She led them outside to where the Mustang sat in morning sunrust, looking almost intentional under the light, like weathering that told stories instead of diminishment. Catherine wrinkled her nose. This is your demonstration. This is the original, the first Aurora engine ever built. It's been running for 15 years. It's survived cross-country trips, California summers, freezing winters. It's never needed major repair. It's never needed fuel. Never needed fuel. Catherine's skepticism came through sharp. That's quite a claim. Victoria opened the hood. The Boeing engineers crowded around, doubt giving way to curiosity as they examined components that looked both familiar and alien. Conventional parts arranged in unconventional configuration systems that suggested principles they recognized but couldn't quite place. Victoria pointed out energy recapture systems, regenerative loops, harmonized flow regulators. Jake connected monitoring equipment while Victoria climbed into the driver's seat, leather cracked and worn, but comfortable in the way only familiar things could be. She turned the key. The engine sang. That perfect, impossible sound filled the parking lot. Boeing engineers stared at tablets, watching data flow across screens, energy in energy, recycled energy out. A loop that sustained itself, that grew stronger over time instead of weaker. One engineer whispered something that sounded like prayer. That's not possible. And yet there it is. The demonstration lasted an hour. Victoria answered every question, explained every component, walked through technical details without overselling or exaggerating. When it ended, Catherine stood in silence, staring at the Mustang like she was seeing the future taking shape in rust and determination. I've been in this industry 32 years. I've seen people promise miracles. Most were lying. A few were delusional. She shook her head slowly. But this is real. It's real and we're ready to scale it. Catherine turned to face Victoria fully. I know who you are, Miss Hayes. I know what your father did. There are people at Boeing who think we shouldn't be anywhere near you or this company. Victoria's stomach tightened, but she held the gaze. What do you think? I think people can change. I think technology doesn't care about politics or history. And I think this engine could transform the entire aviation industry. Catherine extended her hand. Boeing is prepared to offer an exclusive partnership agreement. $10 billion over 5 years in exchange for first-mover access to Aurora technology. Victoria felt dizzy. More money than Hayes Aerospace had been worth more than her father's entire legacy. But it wasn't the money that made her hands shake. It was the validation, the proof that Sarah's dream could survive and flourish exactly as she'd hoped. We'll need to discuss terms. But Victoria Catherine's grip was firm. Don't make us regret this. There won't be a second chance. The Boeing deal announcement made headlines. Aurora Dynamics stock, they'd gone public 3 weeks earlier in a modest IPO that valued the company at $800 million, jumped 47% in a single day. Journalists who'd covered Jake's initial press conference returned with follow-up questions about timelines and production capacity and whether this technology could really deliver on its promises. But something else was happening in the background, something Victoria didn't notice at first because she was too focused on scaling production and hiring engineers and managing growth that felt like controlled chaos. Brad Thornton was making moves. She discovered it by accident, overhearing a phone conversation Marcus was having with a supplier about specifications that had mysteriously changed. When Victoria investigated, she found a pattern. Small sabotages, nothing dramatic enough to halt production, but enough to create delays and doubts. Suppliers suddenly questioning Aurora's credit. Regulatory agencies receiving anonymous tips about safety concerns. Technical specifications leaked to competitors before Aurora could file additional patents. Someone with inside knowledge of how Hayes Aerospace operated was trying to destroy them. Victoria called Jake into her office. Their office now, they'd pushed 2 desks together and worked side by side most days. We have a mole. Someone's leaking information, sabotaging relationships. This isn't random. These are tactics my father used to bury competitors. Jake leaned against the desk processing. Who would have that knowledge? Victoria's eyes widened as pieces fell into place. Brad Thornton. He was my father's right hand 15 years ago. He knew about the stolen patents, helped orchestrate the cover-up. When I exposed everything, I made him vulnerable. They set a trap. Fake technical meeting where Victoria mentioned a breakthrough that didn't exist, a new energy recapture mechanism that could increase efficiency by 30%. That night, they watched security footage as Brad broke into the workshop, photographed documents, planted malware on computers they'd left deliberately accessible. The next morning, Victoria walked into a Hayes Aerospace board meeting, uninvited Jake, beside her tablet in hand, containing evidence they'd gathered over 3 weeks once they'd started looking. The current board people who'd voted her out, who'd frozen her assets, who'd talked about criminal charges, looked up in shock as she entered without announcement. I'd like to introduce someone who was there from the beginning. She played the footage, showed documents, laid out email trails, and offshore payments Brad had been receiving from companies trying to steal Aurora's secrets. Brad tried to deny it, voice rising. This is ridiculous. You're desperate, trying to deflect from your own failures. These are your emails to a Chinese competitor. These are payments from offshore accounts. You helped my father steal from Jake Sullivan. And when I tried to make it right, you tried to destroy us. Security was already moving. Board members sat stunned as Brad was escorted out, his face red with rage, and something that might have been fear. Your father would be ashamed of you, Victoria. Good. Her response came cold and clear. I'm ashamed of him too. That's the difference between us. After Brad's arrest, the remaining Hayes Aerospace Board approached Victoria with a settlement offer. They would license Aurora technology, pay royalties, provide resources for research and development. The company that had stolen the engine would now pay for the privilege of using it. Money that would fund research for years. Money that transformed theft into restitution. But something else was happening too. Something quieter, but just as important. Emma Sullivan and Lily Hayes had encountered each other at Aurora Dynamics one afternoon when Victoria's daughter had shown up after school looking for her mother. Emma was 14, serious and curious, carrying her mother's intelligence and her father's determination. Lily was 12, sensitive and watchful, desperate for attention. Her mother had been too busy to give before everything changed. They bonded over shared experience, the strangeness of having single parents who worked too much, the loneliness of homes that felt empty, the confusion of watching their parents transform. It's weird, right? Lily spoke first, voice tentative. My mom working with your dad. Emma shrugged in that teenage way of pretending not to care about things that mattered deeply. Yeah, but weird isn't always bad. Your mom works harder than anyone I've seen. And she talks about my mom like she really cares. Victoria was walking past when she heard their voices. She stopped hidden, listening. Does your dad hate my mom? Emma considered carefully. I don't think so. I think he's scared. Scared of trusting someone again. Scared of letting someone new into our lives. It was just him and me for so long. My mom's scared too. Lily's voice was so quiet Victoria almost couldn't hear. She's different now. She smiles more. Real smiles. I haven't seen her like this since Dad died. Victoria felt tears burning. She'd been so focused on redemption and work that she hadn't realized how much Lily had been watching, hoping, waiting for her mother to come back from wherever she'd been lost. That night, Victoria went home early for the first time in months. Found Lily doing homework with headphones on. Knocked gently. Lily pulled off the headphones, surprise crossing her face. You're home, I am. Want to get dinner? Just us. No work, no phones. Lily's smile was like sunrise. Really, really. And I'm sorry I've been absent. I'm sorry I made you feel invisible. That ends now. They went to the small Italian place Lily loved, the kind of restaurant Victoria never would have chosen before because it didn't impress anyone important. They talked about school and friends and Lily's fear that she wasn't enough. Victoria held her daughter's hand across the table. You are more than enough. You've always been enough. I was just too blind to see it. But I see you now and I'm never looking away again. Meanwhile, Jake was having a similar conversation with Emma in their apartment, eating Chinese takeout from containers on the couch that had been Sarah's favorite. I like Victoria. Emma spoke carefully, knowing this territory was complicated. I know what her father did, but she's not him. She works harder than anyone and she talks about mom like mom mattered. Jake was quiet for a long moment. She does matter. And yes, Victoria is different. She's trying very hard to be different. Emma hesitated, then pushed forward. Dad, you haven't been happy in a long time. Not really happy, but lately you smile more. You laugh. Is that because of her? Jake looked at his daughter, this girl becoming a woman who saw too much and understood even more. Maybe. I don't know. I haven't felt this way since your mother, and I don't know if I'm allowed to. Mom would want you to be happy. She told me that once when she was sick. She made me promise that if you ever found someone who made you feel alive again, I'd be okay with it. Emma's eyes were shining. I'm okay with it, Dad. More than okay. I think Mom would have liked Victoria. Not who she was, but who she's becoming. The next time Jake and Victoria were alone in the workshop working late on prototype refinement, they reached for the same tool simultaneously. Their hands touched. Both froze. Neither pulled away. Victoria Jake's voice was barely above a whisper. I know this is complicated. It's not complicated. It's terrifying. I haven't felt this way since Sarah, and I don't know if I'm allowed to. You're not taking anything I'm offering. If you want it, if you think you're ready. Victoria looked at him. This man she'd humiliated, whose life her father had destroyed, who'd given her a second chance when no one else would. I don't know if I'm ready, but I don't want to run from it either. Jake leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away. Victoria didn't pull away. Their lips met, gentle and tentative and full of promise. When they parted, both had tears. Was that okay? That was more than okay. 2 weeks later, Emma and Lily executed their plan. They'd been conspiring, these daughters who recognized what their parents were too scared to admit. Emma called Jake, saying Victoria needed to discuss Boeing contracts over dinner. Lily called Victoria, saying Jake wanted input on technical specifications. Both arrived at the restaurant to find their daughters sitting at a table grinning. "Surprise, we made you a date." Emma's voice carried satisfaction and mischief. "You two need to stop being scared and just admit you like each other." Lily added her contribution. "You both deserve to be happy, and we want to be a family. A real family." Jake and Victoria looked at each other, then at their daughters, then back at each other. Jake started laughing first. Victoria followed. They sat down at the table, and the four of them had dinner together, talking and laughing and building the foundation of something new. That dinner became weekly, then twice weekly. Then Jake and Emma were at Victoria's house more often than their apartment. Then Victoria was keeping a toothbrush at Jake's place. Then the question wasn't if they were together, but when they'd make it official. 6 months after the Boeing deal, Jake asked her to marry him. No ring, no elaborate proposal. Just the two of them in the workshop late at night, covered in grease, having solved a difficult engineering problem together. "Marry me, not because you owe me anything. Marry me because when I look at you, I see someone worth building a future with. Someone who understands that the best things are the ones we create together." Victoria said yes without hesitation. Emma and Lily, who'd been eavesdropping from the office, came running out, screaming with joy. The wedding was small, close friends and family only. Richard Morrison walked Victoria down the aisle, tears streaming down his ancient face. Patricia Reeves was there, having left Hayes Aerospace to join Aurora full-time. Emma and Lily served as joint maids of honor, wearing matching dresses they'd picked out together. Jake's vows were simple. "Sarah taught me that love isn't about holding on to the past. It's about having the courage to build something new. Victoria, you've shown me that people can change that. Broken things can be repaired. I promise to spend every day helping you become who you want to be." Victoria's vows came through tears. "Jake, you gave me a second chance when I didn't deserve one. You taught me that real value comes from what you build, not what you inherit. I promise to spend every day honoring Sarah's legacy and creating our future." 10 months after the wedding, the first commercial flight using Aurora engine technology took off from San Francisco International. Jake and Victoria stood on the observation deck with Emma and Lily, all four holding hands. The Boeing 787 had been retrofitted with Aurora propulsion painted in special livery, deep blue with gold accents. On the tail, a single word in elegant script, Sarah. Jake saw the name and started crying immediately. "You didn't have to do that. Name it after her." "Yes, I did. This is her achievement, her legacy. The world needs to know who made this possible." The engine spooled up, that familiar sound Victoria had first heard in a parking lot what felt like a lifetime ago. The aircraft began to move faster and faster until it lifted off and climbed into blue California sky. "She's flying." Jake's whisper broke on the words. "Sarah's finally flying." Victoria held him as he cried. Emma and Lily pressed close on either side. Four of them standing together as family while the crowd erupted in cheers. When the plane disappeared into clouds, Jake wiped his eyes and turned to Victoria. "Thank you for everything, for changing, for helping me finish what we started. I should be thanking you. You gave me a chance when I didn't deserve one. We taught each other. That's what partnership means." 5 years later, the National Museum of American Innovation created a permanent exhibit honoring the Aurora engine. They wanted to display the original prototype, the rusted Mustang, that had carried the secret through 15 years of obscurity. Jake agreed on one condition: Victoria had to be there for the unveiling. The ceremony was held on a crisp November afternoon. The museum had recreated Aurora's original workshop, complete with workbenches and diagnostic equipment. At the center sat the Mustang rust-preserved paint untouched exactly as it had looked that day in the parking lot. A bronze plaque stood beside it. Victoria read it aloud during her speech to hundreds gathered. This vehicle carried a revolution. For 15 years, it transported a dream that powerful forces tried to destroy. The Aurora engine represents one of the most significant technological achievements in human history. But more than that, it represents the power of persistence, the strength of love, and the possibility of redemption. She walked to the Mustang, put her hand on the hood. I want to tell you about a woman I never met, but who changed my life forever. Her name was Sarah Sullivan, and she believed that technology exists to serve humanity. She believed the universe doesn't have a scarcity problem, it has a wisdom problem. She believed waste can become wealth and loss can become gain. Victoria's voice broke slightly. Sarah died believing her work had been buried. But she was wrong. Her work survived. Her dreams survived. And today, millions of people live better lives because of what she built. She turned back to the crowd. I'm not the hero of this story. I'm the villain who learned to be something else, the proof that even the worst version of ourselves doesn't have to be the final version. Victoria walked back to where Jake stood with Emma and Lily family built from ruins of tragedy. This car taught me what real value looks like. It's not about shine or status. It's about what you build, what you protect, what you're willing to sacrifice to make things right. After the ceremony, when crowds had dispersed, Victoria and Jake stood alone beside the Mustang. Jake reached into his pocket, pulled out a small object, a key old and worn metal smooth from years of use. This is the original key, the one Sarah used to start the engine for the very first time. I've carried it everywhere for 20 years. He held it out to Victoria. I want you to have it. Jake, I can't. Yes, you can. Sarah would have wanted this. This key started a revolution. Now it belongs to the woman who helped finish it. Victoria took the key with trembling hands, warm from Jake's pocket. What am I supposed to do with it, remember? Every time you doubt yourself, hold this key and remember what it started. Remember that the most valuable things aren't always visible. Sometimes they're hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to look past the rust and see the gold underneath. Outside the museum windows, Victoria could see Emma and Lily waiting, laughing about something only sisters would find funny. She could see the future they were building together, brick by brick, transformed from rubble of everything that had been destroyed. Some revolutions start with a bang, others start with a whisper, and some, the ones that matter most, start with a rusted old car, an engine that shouldn't exist, and two people brave enough to believe that even the most broken things can be made to run again.